To the debate. Today we are walking straight into a minefield. It's a cultural shift that has completely rewritten the script on how we talk, how we fight, how we parent, and, well, how we view our own minds. We are examining the explosion of therapy culture.
Yeah, it is everywhere.
It really is. I mean, we have more language for our emotions than any generation in human history. We have more diagnoses, more awareness, and more tools at our disposal. But the source material asks a devastatingly simple, perhaps even offensive question. Is it actually working?
Or, to put it a bit more bluntly, are we healing or are we just hiding?
Right. That is the central provocation here. We're dissecting the therapy paradox. On one side, the argument is that society has finally become emotionally literate, right? We're moving away from that damaging, stoic repression of the 20th century. But on the other side, there is this growing, gnawing sense that this rise in therapy culture hasn't actually made us more self-aware, but merely more self-absorbed.
Exactly. It's the difference between self-actualization and self-obsession. And I think we need to be really honest about the core friction here. Is modern mental health culture actually building emotional intelligence, true resilience, or is it creating a kind of social fragility where a clinical explanation just replaces personal ownership?
It's a heavy question, and one we need to handle with care. I will be representing the view that you cannot fix a machine you don't understand. The idea that understanding trauma, understanding attachment styles, and the mechanisms of our psychology, that is the absolute prerequisite for accountability.
And I will be taking the opposing view. I'm drawing on the material that suggests we are actually weakening accountability, that we're turning every minor discomfort into a clinical diagnosis and essentially giving people a really sophisticated, university-level vocabulary to just excuse their lack of basic discipline.
Well, let's get right into the position statements because the divide here is incredibly sharp. I want to understand your premise first. Why do you believe that having more knowledge about our minds is somehow hindering our growth?
Because it's not the knowledge, it's the application. My position, which is based directly on the source material, is what I call the softness argument. We have inadvertently created a culture where victim status has become a form of social currency. You see this vividly on social media, but it's completely bleeding into real life now. Pain equals engagement. Vulnerability is rewarded with likes, with validation, with sympathy, but accountability, genuine resilience, that's met with silence, or worse, it's criticized.
But that's a pretty cynical view of vulnerability, isn't it? Do you really think people are faking their struggles for likes?
Not faking it, monetizing it, incentivizing it. Look, the material points out that it is infinitely easier to explain why you are broken using all the correct clinical terms, like intergenerational trauma or neurodivergence, than it is to do the disciplined, boring, completely unglamorous work of actually rebuilding yourself. We have people walking around wearing their trauma like a badge of honor rather than a problem to be solved. So my stance is this. Have we built a culture where being hurt is rewarded and being disciplined is criticized as toxic? We're basically handing people excuses on a silver platter.
I hear that, but I honestly think you're missing the forest for the trees here. My position is the literacy argument. The alternative to this so-called softness you're decrying is the toughness of the past. And let's be very clear about that. It was a massive failure.
Was it, though?
Yes, absolutely. The source material highlights that previous generations didn't actually have grit or resilience in the way we romanticize it today. They had repression. Men died of heart attacks at 50 because they literally couldn't process stress. Parents didn't apologize to their kids. They just drank. Trauma wasn't discussed. It was just buried until it rotted the entire family foundation.
But they built the modern world. I mean, they functioned.
High functioning does not mean healthy. My argument is that you simply cannot change what you don't understand. Identifying why I lash out or why I sabotage my relationships, that's not an excuse, as you claim. It is the necessary diagnostic phase. If we don't have the literacy to read our own emotions, we are just acting out blind rage or silent resentment. So the question I would ask, is it weak to understand yourself? Or is it actually weak to look away because the truth is just too uncomfortable?
Okay, that's a compelling philosophical point. But let's bring this down to the pavement for a second. I want to talk about definitions, because the debate hinges on them. What is trauma? What is accountability? The source material highlights a phenomenon that I think is driving everyone crazy right now, which is the pathologizing of normal life.
Go on, give me an example.
We are seeing a massive inflation in language. We are taking normal human misery and giving it a clinical label. So a bad day is now trauma. A boss who criticizes your work is gaslighting you. A friend who disagrees with you is toxic. Even discipline, actual, necessary structure, is being rebranded as emotional abuse.
I'll concede that social media dilutes these terms. That definitely happens. But there is a real danger in dismissing them too quickly. Just because we didn't have a word for gaslighting 30 years ago doesn't mean the manipulation wasn't real. Language allows us to categorize experiences. When a person realizes, oh, I'm not crazy, this is a recognized pattern of manipulation, that is liberation.
But there is a huge difference between categorization and catastrophizing. I'm not denying pain exists. I'm denying that all pain is pathology. Sometimes aren't you just uncomfortable? The material argues that discomfort used to be the forge of resilience. You went through a hard thing, you survived, you realized you didn't die, and you got stronger. Now, discomfort builds identity. You go through a hard thing, you label it, and you settle into that label like a warm bath. You say, well, I can't do this presentation because I have anxiety. Well, everyone has anxiety. The question is, are you going to let the label be the ceiling of your potential?
But if we don't label it, we risk minimizing it entirely. If I can name the dynamic, if I can look at a relationship and objectively say this is a narcissist-empath dynamic, then I can actually protect myself from it.
Are you protecting yourself, or are you just insulating yourself from reality? Let's ask the listeners right now to do a gut check. Pause for a second. Be honest. When was the last time you labeled a difficult conversation toxic just to avoid hearing a truth you didn't like? Did you use that clinical word to shut down the interaction because it was easier than facing the criticism? Did you call your boss abusive because he demanded you actually hit a deadline?
That's a fair challenge to the audience. It's the difference between protective labeling and defensive labeling. However, precise language allows us to differentiate between constructive criticism and emotional manipulation. The toughness of the past often blurred those lines completely. It allowed abuse to masquerade as character building. We had coaches screaming in kids' faces, breaking their spirits, and we called it grit. I'd argue we are correcting a massive generational overstep.
And I would argue that the pendulum has swung so far that now basic character building is seen as abuse. If a coach raises their voice today, parents are filing lawsuits. But let's look at the mechanism here. The material calls this the step 2 problem. This is the tension between explanation and ownership.
Right, and this is where I think the nuance is most important.
But the nuance is often just used to hide. We need a hypocrisy check here. We have all met people, maybe we are these people, who use their psychological profile as a get-out-of-jail-free card. They say, I'm avoiding this conversation because I have an avoidant attachment style. Or, I yelled because that's my trigger. And the subtext is always, therefore, you cannot be mad at me, and I do not have to change.
Look, I see why you think that's the end point for some people, but for those genuinely doing the work, it's not the end, it's the map. I would argue that identifying the trigger is emotional literacy. It prevents the blind reaction. If I know I have an avoidant attachment style, I can recognize the impulse to run away, identify it as a pattern, and actually choose to stay. That is accountability. That is doing the work.
That's the ideal scenario. That is the university theory of therapy. That is not the cultural reality described in the sources. The material claims we have normalized step 1, the explanation, and we have totally excused step 2, which is the fixing. The why has become a permanent excuse that just stalls recovery indefinitely.
I'm not convinced that it's permanent. Recovery is a messy, nonlinear process. You can't expect someone to undo 20 years of conditioning in a month.
But how long is the process allowed to take before it just becomes a lifestyle? Let's apply this to a real-world relationship scenario to make it concrete. If a partner lashes out at you, screams, breaks a plate, and then says, well, I did that because of my childhood trauma, does that make the lashing out acceptable?
Acceptable? No. Understandable? Yes. And that understanding is crucial.
If you just condemn them, they retreat into shame. And shame is the primary fuel of addiction and rage. If you understand the context, you can offer compassion, which facilitates healing. You can say, I know why this is happening, but we need to find a different way.
But if you just offer compassion without demanding change, you're enabling the behavior. The source material asks a pretty brutal question. At what point did work on yourself become blame everyone else? If I break a plate and you offer me compassion, I might just learn that breaking plates gets me a hug instead of a consequence.
It shouldn't be blame, it should be context. Context allows us to separate the person from the behavior.
Context without correction is just noise. Think about your last argument with a spouse or parent. Anyone listening. Did you use your background to explain your bad behavior? And if you did you ever actually fix the behavior, or did you just polish the explanation? Did you get better at not yelling, or did you just get better at explaining exactly why you yell?
If the behavior doesn't change, the insight is completely wasted. It's like buying a treadmill and using it as a clothes rack. But I would argue that without the insight, the behavior cannot change. You seem to think we can just will ourselves into being better without looking under the hood. That's the old way. Pull yourself up by your bootstraps. It doesn't work for psychological wounds.
I think looking under the hood is fine as long as you eventually close the hood and drive the car. We seem to be parked on the side of the road admiring the engine while the tires are flat. And speaking of stalling progress, we have to talk about the weapons we use to do it. The source material calls this weaponized vocabulary.
Weaponized seems really aggressive for terms that are meant to help us relate to one another. These are fundamentally tools of empathy.
It is aggressive because the usage is aggressive. We aren't using these words to heal, we are using them to win arguments. The source explicitly discusses terms like boundaries and invalidating. These are clinical tools that have been turned into debate-ending nukes.
Boundaries are essential. They are the demarcation of where I end and you begin. Without boundaries, we have enmeshment, we have codependency. To say they are weaponized seems to fundamentally misunderstand their purpose.
Oh, I understand their purpose perfectly. I'm critiquing their application. The source notes a profound hypocrisy here. We say boundaries matter unless someone sets one against us. But more than that, look at how the word is used in the wild right now. If you criticize me, I can say, you are invalidating my lived experience. Boom. Debate over. You aren't allowed to speak anymore because you've committed a therapy sin. If you disagree with my actions, I can say, you are violating my boundaries. It's a literal shield against accountability.
Let me offer a different perspective on that. A boundary is not a shield against accountability. It's a shield against toxicity. For example, in a workplace with an abusive boss, knowing you can set a boundary saying, I will not be spoken to that way, is incredibly empowering. It's not dodging work, it's demanding basic respect.
In a clear-cut case of abuse, absolutely. But we aren't just using it for abuse anymore. We are using it for discomfort. We use boundaries to control other people's behavior rather than our own. A boundary is supposed to be, if you do X, I will remove myself. Instead, it's become, you cannot do X because it upsets me. That's not a boundary, that's control masquerading as self-care. This is the HRification of friendship. Have you seen this? Friends sending calendar invites to process a conflict?
The HRification, that's an interesting phrase. It sounds cold, but isn't it better than the alternative, which is ghosting or exploding? If friends are setting aside time to talk through issues clearly, that sounds like maturity to me.
Or it sounds like we are stripping the messy humanity out of human relationships and replacing it with procedural compliance. But I want to push back on this idea that these terms are just neutral tools. When someone says they are being invalidated, they are often expressing that their reality is being denied. That is a psychological harm, you say.
Yes, systematic invalidation. Telling someone what they feel isn't real is a form of gaslighting.
Or they are just wrong, and they don't want to hear it. Intellectual disagreement is not invalidation. Telling someone they messed up a project is not gaslighting. We have conflated feeling bad with being wronged. And this leads us to the biggest issue in the material, the tension between resilience and repression.
We are really pushing extremes here.
We are. And this is where the stakes are the absolute highest, especially regarding how we raise the next generation. Exactly. The source asks, Are we raising resilient adults, or are we raising emotionally fragile ones? If we validate every single feeling, if we protect children from every discomfort, if every teacher who grades harshly is toxic, are we preparing them for the world, or are we setting them up to completely shatter the moment they hit the real world?
But consider the alternative. Are we raising emotionally intelligent adults, or are we just repeating the cycle of the emotionally suppressed ones of the past? You talk about the toughness of previous generations. Let's look at the source material again. It points out that those tough people often couldn't regulate anger. They were high performers who destroyed their families. They were disciplined at work and chaotic at home. Is that really strength?
It's a form of strength. It's functional strength. It keeps the lights on.
I'm not convinced by that line of reasoning because a strength that destroys your personal life isn't strength, it's brittleness. It looks hard on the outside, but it breaks easily under emotional pressure. I argue that the softness you see is actually the hard work of processing what those previous generations were simply too afraid to face. The father who drinks himself to sleep isn't strong. He's hiding. The father who goes to therapy to learn how to talk to his son without yelling, he is doing the heavy lifting.
That's a compelling argument, and I will grant you that the silent generation model had major flaws. But my counterpunch is this. While the old way might have been repression, the current correction has gone way too far. We aren't just fixing the repression, we are actively dismantling the resilience. We are providing weaker people better vocabulary to excuse their flaws. We are teaching kids that their feelings are facts, and that is a dangerous, dangerous lesson.
Feelings aren't facts, but they are data. They tell us something is happening. If we teach kids to ignore that data, they grow up numb.
But if we teach them that the data is the only thing that matters, they grow up narcissistic. That's the paradox here. If the tools work so well, why does the source material suggest we are seeing more fragility, not less? Why does the material ask if we are just hiding behind the therapy speak? Look at the anxiety rates, look at the depression rates. We talk about it more than ever, yet we seem to be getting worse. Explain that.
Because growth is messy. We are in the middle of a massive cultural transition right now. We are moving from a model of shut up and deal with it to understand it and integrate it. Of course it looks messy. Of course there's misuse. But the goal, emotional literacy, is the only sustainable path forward. The rise in numbers might just be a rise in reporting. People used to suffer in complete silence. Now they suffer out loud. That looks like an increase, but it might just be the truth finally coming to light.
Or it's a path to a narcissism, where my feelings are the only truth that matters. I worry that we are forgetting that the world doesn't care about your trauma. It cares about your contribution. And if you spend all your energy analyzing your trauma, you have no energy left to actually contribute. You become a project, not a person.
I see why you think that. But I believe that healing the trauma actually frees up the energy to contribute. The step 2 you want so badly, the fixing, cannot happen if the person is stuck in a subconscious loop they can't even see. You want them to drive the car, but the engine is seized. Therapy unseizes the engine.
And I believe that if you don't demand step 2, they will stay in the loop forever because the loop is comfortable. The loop gets them sympathy, the loop gets them validation, the loop is safe. Stepping out of the loop into the cold, hard world of accountability, that's terrifying. And our culture is helping them stay warm in the loop. We are handing out blankets when we should be handing out maps.
Well, we are nearing the end of our time, and as usual, we are not going to tie this up with a neat bow. The tension here is the whole point.
No middle ground today. This is too fundamental.
So let's summarize where we stand. From my perspective, the rise of therapy culture and emotional literacy is a completely necessary evolution. The toughness of the past was often just a mask for fear of feeling, fear of vulnerability. I warn that without understanding our past and our trauma, we are doomed to repeat it blindly. Awareness, no matter how clumsy it looks in the beginning, is the only path to true change.
And from my perspective, awareness that doesn't lead to immediate behavioral change is just narcissism. My warning is that if healing never ends, it is just hiding. We are in danger of raising a generation that can articulate exactly why they can't function, but cannot actually function. If therapy doesn't build stronger people, if it just gives weaker people better vocabulary, then it is a failed experiment.
So I leave you with this question.
Has therapy changed discipline, or has it just revealed how damaging the old ways actually were?
And I leave you with the final provocation from our source. Does therapy build stronger people, or does it just give weaker people better words to excuse their weakness?
Are we healing?
Or are we hiding?